In the next 8 to 10 minutes, we'll cover a lot of ground related to the history of interpreting, then more specifically the history of sign language interpreting in the United States, and finally the professionalization journey that we're still traveling. Interpreting has been around for centuries and was practiced whenever country met country for trade or war. The first interpreters were not hired as professionals, but were slaves and/or advisors. The first spoken language interpreters, who were documented and recognized as professionals, were used after World War I in the post-war trials. These interpreters used consecutive interpreting. As technology progressed, so did the interpreting profession. With the invention of headphones, simultaneous interpreting became a possibility for spoken language interpreters. The first formal documented use of sign language interpreting was post-World War I during the Nuremberg trials. Once predominantly used only for international arena, for politics and business trades, spoken language interpreting is now becoming more frequent in legal, medical, and Social Security settings. Educational requirements and credentialing standards for spoken language interpreters are still undefined. Only Spanish-English interpreters have a screening credential in the United States, which is used for court interpreting. Screenings are mostly provided by hiring agencies, not by a national organization, and there is no codified standard of ethics or practice. This is vastly different than what we've been exploring in our class these past few weeks, focused on ASL English interpreting. Interpreting for American Sign Language in English has taken a different route of development. In 1954, the Vocational Rehabilitation Act Amendment passed, which, among other things, recognized the need for interpreting services for the deaf. However, the amendment did not provide funding, training, or education of interpreters. In the following year, Boyce Williams, a deaf man, was hired as a consultant by the Vocational Rehabilitation Administration in the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Williams' focus was on the lack of programs for the deaf. He also founded a mental health program for the deaf, identifying areas lacking services that were needed, and found funding for those services. By 1957, Williams conducted over 100 workshops focusing on training professionals who work with deaf individuals or those with hearing loss. At these trainings, Williams included deaf people as participants to get their views on what could help the deaf community. This sounds like a big deal because it was. A side note of this, which has an effect on our profession, is that ASL English interpreters were needed at these trainings. Interpreting was not yet recognized as a profession, and those who interpreted these workshops were volunteers, who were either teachers of the deaf, codas, or individuals who had deaf ministries. Williams noted the lack of trained interpreters and wrote a 5-year grant to try to increase the supply of interpreters. Another positive result of the workshops came from the interaction of the participants. Those professionals participating in learning through the workshops also learned enough sign to communicate at some level with deaf community members. In 1964, the U.S. Department of Health, Education and Welfare appointed Dr. Homer Babbage, Jr. as chair of a new advisory committee which was tasked with assessing the educational needs of deaf individuals from preschool into adulthood in order to make recommendations to improve education for the deaf. The following year, 1965, the committee submitted their findings in what is now called the Babbage Report. These findings covered many topics, including the need for interpreters at the K-12 educational system, as well as the college and university level. There were 5 workshops planned to address the recommendations from the Babbage Report. The first workshop was held at Ball State Teachers College, June 14th through 17th, 1964. It was at this workshop that RID was founded. For those of you playing at home, it may seem as though we just went through a time warp. The Babbage Report was submitted in 1965. However, the first workshop on interpreter education was in 1964. This is due to Boyce Williams' previous data on the lack of interpreters and the training grant that he wrote. After all, Williams and Babbage worked under the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at the same time. The 5 grant-funded workshops between June 1964 and July 1966 focused on developing training materials, identifying aspects of interpreting in different situations, and determining parameters for interpreter education programs. 2 other key things happened in this same time window of 1965. William Stokoe published the first Dictionary of American Sign Language on linguistic principles, upon which ASL was given the proper status of being a language. Secondly, in 1965, interpreters who worked in the vocational rehabilitation setting received payment for the first time. The 1950s and 60s were a pivotal time for deaf education, access to employment training, and the training of ASL interpreters. The following decades of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s saw a boom in research related to interpreter education and curriculum development, the studies of American Sign Language as a language in its own right, and the development of interpreter training programs across the country. In 1990, Congress passed the Americans with Disability Act, which is the first comprehensive civil rights law encompassing disabilities in all public service, employment, medical, and telecommunication arenas. Next, we're going to talk about our journey towards professionalization, which is the process an occupation undergoes to become a profession. A profession is defined differently than an occupation. According to definition, a profession requires advanced study in a specialized field performed by a group of qualified people. Whittemarithew and Johnson researched some aspects of our journey to professionalization in 2004. There are several characteristics attributed to professionalization, which are listed on the chart Emergence in the Field of Sign Language Interpreting, posted on our Blackboard folder for the week. There are several main characteristics that we're continuing to improve. One characteristic, standardized educational foundation for entry into the profession, is a complex concept for American Sign Language English interpreters. In the past, CODAs and others with ties to the deaf community were the only interpreters. Several decades later, interpreter education has progressed leaps and bounds in the academic setting. In fact, there's now an educational requirement of a bachelor's degree in order to sit for the NIC under RID and NAD. Other areas that could use improvement on the track to professional status are authority over policies impacting us, a lack of formal mentorship into the field, a standard salary range, and a lack of understanding what we do as professionals by people outside of the interpreting field. We do have several strong characteristics of professionalization, including our code of professional conduct, a shared identity, and established means of continuing professional development. In the same article, Whittemarithew and Johnson created a professionalization continuum, which places American Sign Language interpreters as an emerging profession and has comparisons to other professions. I hope this video builds on the knowledge you have of the history and professional status of ASL English interpreting.